Let's come back to South Africa and one of our top stories now. The Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein has dismissed former President Jacob Zuma's medical parole appeal with costs. Zuma and the Department of Correctional Services challenged the High Court order, which declared his release on medical parole irrational, unlawful and unconstitutional. Nicole Fritz from the Helen Suzman Foundation joins me for more. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Just your reaction to that ruling.
Well, the judgment is an important judgment. It represents a significant moment in our constitutional democracy in dismissing the appeal and holding that the medical parole was unlawfully granted by the Commissioner, Arthur Fraser. I think the court very clearly, a full bench of the Supreme Court of Appeal, very clearly affirms the importance of equality before the law, says that no matter the position you occupy, no matter the spectre of threat that you might wave, all are equal before the law, and the law requires full compliance and observance before it. And to that extent, I think it is an important, significant judgment to be welcomed. Obviously, it holds out potentially serious consequences for Mr. Zuma, and nobody can celebrate the idea that an elderly man faces the return to jail.
You've been quoted as the Helen Suzman Foundation as saying that Arthur Fraser knew he was acting unlawfully. Why?
Well, this follows on a story which broke today that during Mr. Fraser's tenure as Commissioner, a tenure of 3.5 years, there were about 100 instances where medical parole was sought. And in those 100 instances, there was only one occasion where Mr. Fraser overturned the recommendation of the Medical Parole Advisory Board. And while it is not disclosed who that one matter pertained to, given what we know, we have to assume that that one matter was in respect of former President Jacob Zuma.
When it comes to the reaction around the former president being jailed initially and having to head back to jail now, what's your reaction on the quite clear challenges or people saying that there will be more trouble if he goes back to jail, and we will see some of the perhaps unrest that we saw in July last year as a result of that?
Look, I think it is important, and to some extent we have to sort of honour our courts for, even in a context such as this, insisting that they will not bow or bend before the prospect of threat or intimidation. As I said, equality before the law demands that there are no special favours or special treatment handed out. But it is important to keep in mind that the court also says that it is not for them, as the Supreme Court of Appeal, to decide whether the period that Mr. Zuma has already served on unlawfully granted medical parole should count towards any calculation of his sentence going forward, but that it is for the Department of Correctional Services to make such determination, and they must take that into account. And so I don't want to speculate, it's not my role, but it does leave out the possibility that in fact the department will then make a determination that even though Mr. Zuma's medical parole was unlawfully granted, he essentially was serving a form of punitive sanction, and that must be calculated and must count in any calculation of a further sentence served. So at this point, we don't know whether, in fact, Mr. Zuma will have to spend any further time, will spend another night in jail. That the judgment does not hold out that conclusion.
Yeah. Nicole, in the beginning of our interview, you spoke about how, although it was important to ensure that the law, and there's a clarity about that the law applies to everybody equally in South Africa, there is also a challenge because no one wants to celebrate seeing an older person going to jail. If we just move away from that, there's a lot of politically fraught litigation in South Africa over the last few years. And then also the issue of the judiciary and certain interests, or the judiciary serving certain interests, coming up as a narrative, whether by bad actors or genuinely by people in the judiciary as well. What would your response to that be?
Look, it's a complicated question. I think that over the last few years, particularly, and during the period of state capture, right, where we saw certain arms of government not undertaking their constitutional obligations and observing those, it was often left to the courts to try and step into the breach and play the role that government as a whole is required to play. But there's no question that the litigation that we saw brought during the state capture years, especially because the other arms of government were often unresponsive to concerns as to kind of corruption, hollowing out, kind of demise of our constitutional order. But this heightened role for the courts is now being sought, often, I think, sort of opportunistically by politically motivated litigants, and that is of concern. The courts can't bear, this excessive weight, and certainly it's not for the courts properly to resolve political disputes that are best resolved through the ordinary political process. And I think that those of us who look to be responsible constitutional actors need to recognize that.